philosopher of health, Socrates Pardi. It's a pleasure.
Greg, total pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
I know you like quoting Socrates, so I thought you'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I only really know one of his quotes, so my knowledge of Socrates is very thin.
What were you just doing before I hit record?
I have these inhalation, what are they called? It's peppermint and a bunch of other essential herbs that you can smell, and they make you more alert and awake. I really like them. I don't know if they work, but they smell great.
Uh, you've always got a toy that you're playing with.
Constantly.
When I think back, I think I first came across you listening to the Body RX show, which must have been nearly 15 years ago. And that makes you one of the podcast OGs for sure.
That was one of my first podcasts. That was, as I recall, quite a challenge because some of the other guests on that show were very technical. It was like, I think they were reading from medical textbooks. But the conversations were interesting, and I enjoyed doing it. Rob Wolf was on that, and I believe BioLane. What's his name? Lane Norton?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was a regular contributor. Don't worry, I won't be reading from any medical textbooks. I won't be able to pronounce half the words.
Yeah, but that started the bug in me, and then eventually I wanted to start my own podcast because I like the idea of going directly to the source for people who are generating the research that other people are talking about, asking them about their studies, the reasons for doing them, the details of it, and that beget Human OS Radio, which was a lot of fun to do. Now, I just released an episode last week, but it's every couple of months, so I'm not doing it as aggressively, but I might get back into it.
Why would you speak to scientists when you can speak with influencers?
Fair question.
Being serious, Human OS Radio remains my favourite health podcast, and I periodically bug you to record more of them. But I know that you're a busy man. And when I look back over Human OS Radio episodes, I'm reminded of how you've been ahead of the curve in many ways. You were a very early adopter of wearable technology, and that came through in Dan's plan, which was the precursor for Human OS.
That's right.
And then looking back through episodes, you've covered all sorts of subjects over the years, everything from heterochronic parabiosis to virtual reality. And you've done a lot to educate me both directly and indirectly, and have, I think, quite strongly shaped my thinking. So I want to say thank you for that to begin.
Well, thank you, Greg. That means a lot coming from somebody who, in my opinion, has enormous talent, capability, and good judgment in this space. So some compliments from certain people make more of an impact than others, and I'm humbled by that, and I'm grateful. It's motivating. It's motivating to hear when very good people like your work, you want to do more of it. It encourages you to keep going. So thank you.
Pleasure. So today we're going to discuss problems with the healthcare system and the booming field that is the study of the biology of aging and how to be healthy in the modern world. So that should all be very straightforward in the space of a couple of hours. But before we dive in, I thought that we might begin with what you would like people to take from today's episode at a very high level. And in answering that, I'd love you to imagine that you're speaking to somebody of Desmond's age, just so that we can frame this in relatively simple, easy to understand terms.
Health is a proactive process. We have been raised in a society where we have outsourced a lot of our health, and that has not always been true. That has not been humans' understanding of how to attend to health. But as our society has led to increasing degrees of specialization, We have hired experts to oversee our health, and there's great value that comes from that. However, it is not something that you can outsource directly. So we all have personal responsibility to understand health, and to, over time, craft our own relationship with it so that it is personal. It is not trying to replicate another person's approach to health, and hopefully is increasingly wise, and also based off a lot of personal empirical knowledge, which I think is looked at oftentimes as something that we should not do. We should just rely entirely on experts. But we are unique organisms that are, of course, human. So there's a great deal of overlap and similarity being a human to others. And yet we are unique. We are unique in our set of experiences and exposures that we accrete in life. And with a better understanding of our health, what it means, and through mindful attention to what really works and makes us feel good, we can get increasingly good at taking care of ourselves, which is just in time for when we need excellent skill at doing so to affect our aging process. So that, I think, is the high level here for the value that somebody should get from this show, and how I think people should conceive of health in their life.
And I know that you've mentioned conceiving of Human OS as a health training platform, in that some of us need to learn or relearn how to actually be healthy. And it's only by engaging in those behaviors on a regular basis that we get good at being healthy and can realize our potential. I know you've been writing a book with Dr. Josh Turknett, and in doing so, thinking a lot about how to define health and health span and well-being and all sorts of related concepts. And I don't want to get caught up on semantics here, because I think a lot of people intuitively understand these terms. But I wonder if you could describe how you currently conceptualize health and health span.
Yeah. In my exploration into this, I've learned a lot. And the study of the philosophy of what health means and our epistemology around the term, how humans have evolved their understanding, is actually a fascinating journey, and one that I think doesn't get enough attention and credit. We do have an intuitive understanding of what health is, and yet more of a learned wisdom from philosophers and history can actually shape how we go as a society about trying to attain it, and also as individuals. And so part of this book is looking at historical ideas. How has health evolved over the ages? And it's funny to look back on it and think about all of the things that we had gotten wrong in comparison to what we think we know today. But I'd just like to highlight a couple of illustrations about how, even in ancient times, that there are a lot of ideas that have basically endured into today. And sometimes those ideas have been suppressed by strange forces that limited their ability to, either disseminate or to be utilized. But, for example, ancient Egyptians, that culture started about 5,000 years ago. These people performed basic surgeries. They had a solid understanding of human anatomy, and they even had fairly extensive pharmacopoeia of herbs and minerals that were used in treatments. So that's, really from the cradle of civilization, we have ideas that have persisted. Ancient Greeks, they identified natural causes versus supernatural forces that were really what was driving your health before that, or at least during that time. If something was wrong with you, it was thought to be the will of the gods that was causing this. And so attempts to be more healthy were making pleas and sacrifices, pilgrimages, in order to please them. And so the Greek philosophy had a major shift in scientific reason, and also in medical ethics. So how we would, even treat an individual. And they also had, something that also persisted is they had very detailed record keeping, which would lay the groundwork basically for clinical diagnosis. So they made keen observations, which is basically a theme of history. Making keen observations through empiricism, we were just as enabled back then to identify things that could work by paying close attention, instead of trying to force a philosophy on top of the observation and say the reason or cause for this is X, Y, and Z. If you just paid attention to what was going on, there were learnings to happen, and the Greeks were good at that. Ancient Romans, similarly, they were first to create public health infrastructure with aqueducts and sewers, so they recognized sanitation was important. And they also, in their militaries, they had surgical techniques and even field hospitals to treat wounded people. You go more east, you have traditional Chinese medicine. They, of course, were using herbs and remedies more like in the first personalized medicine type of source, so actually trying to treat the individual in a very specific way for what their needs were. They also had a strong emphasis on prevention through a way of life, diet, exercise, lifestyle adjustments, things like that. And then also with Indian Ayurveda. So what I found really interesting in studying Ayurveda is that they had this concept of daily routines and also seasonal regimens for maintaining health. So that was in relationship to what are your routines on a daily basis and how do those change given the forces of nature over a year period. And they also encourage things that, now are very popular, things like yoga and meditation that are having a resurgence in a way of popularity. So there's a lot that we can learn from our history. And then humans really entered into what I consider like a dark period for a while, the dark ages, but there were also exceptions. So parts of the world where religion was authoritatively suppressing scientific thought, empirical learning. Other areas of the world, like the Islamic world, they were having a renaissance themselves during that time. So figures like Avicenna wrote the Canon of Medicine, which became pretty standard within the Islamic world. And they had the first Bemaristans, which were hospitals, and also medical schools. So they had, it was their time of flourishing. And then later, of course, coming out of the Dark Ages, we had this Renaissance period. And then we had figures like Paracelsus, who lived in the 15th and 16th century. He was a Swiss physician, probably the most influential physician during Western Europe medical renaissance. And he, again, brought empiricism into the discussion. So he was traveling through around various countries, present at various wars and battlegrounds. And he felt that doctors needed to have a natural science education, but also an empirical eye. So his ideas were you had to have direct observation. And that, I think, is interesting today when we have a lot of scientists that don't work directly with people, but work in an ivory tower and aren't making that connection. And you see a drop in, we'll say value, just misguidedness that comes exclusively through intellectual thought. So direct observation and received wisdom is a great combination. In fact, I wanted to bring that up because I think that is such an interesting idea that is a very strong idea that needs to persist today. Particularly as we get farther and farther into the cell, if you will, and into the molecule, not losing touch with what the working directly with people looks like. So all of that is preamble to our health history. Obviously, there is a lot more, but there really wasn't any standards for how to describe health and what it means. And so with recognition of that, the United Nations after World War II, they gathered 51 diplomats from all different countries. And this was an organization that was committed to maintaining international peace and harmony and promoting social progress. And one of the things that they wanted to do was create a global health organization, which became the World Health Organization. And one of the parts of the original charter for the World Health Organization was to actually establish unity on the concept of what health is. And they offered a definition that has persisted and is utilized a lot today, so that health is a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being and not merely the absence of disease. And that was an advancement for that time, but it also suffered a lot of criticism because who here can say that they have complete physical, mental, and social well-being? It feels like an unattainable aspiration. And then you might ask, well, who is healthy if, is nobody healthy then? And so there was a lot, it was an advancement, but had serious limitations there. So they did make some alterations later in 1986 that I actually like quite a bit. And that is that, health is the extent to which an individual can cope with the environment. But it is also a resource for everyday life. The health you have helps you live the life that you want or have. And I think that is a key idea, that if we can embody that individually, then we are much more likely to attend to health now versus thinking it as something that we can offload into the future when a health crisis occurs. And that thinking is, again, a part of this system of specialization where we have offloaded our health to experts. So that is really key. Another key part of that definition, by the way, is that health is not the objective of living. So we have other objectives of living, and health can support those. But you have now figures that are popular, that have blogs, podcasts that are well known, and their life is seemingly mostly occupied with attending to their health. And I've thought a lot about that. Think about Brian Johnson. Is that bad? Maybe not for him, because health seems to be his hobby. But it is also not something that people should look at and think, if I'm not doing what he's doing, then I am failing. So, this is all kind of leading to my own definition, which I'll offer you now, and you can react to it. But I'm probably going to modify this a bit, but here's where I'm at with it now: that health is the sum total of all physiological processes that enable life and the operations that support it. Okay, and its magnitude is reflected by its ability to handle a range of stressors common to that species in its natural environmental niche. That's a meaty, rich part of this. And then secondarily, also by the ability to acclimate to conditions that fall outside of that common range of experiences, right? And so being human means that our evolutionary past has shaped us to thrive within a certain environmental context. And that is increasingly important today, given modern life's unique forces that, actually have us live in a very different way than most of our time evolving on this planet.
There's a lot in there to unpack, as always. If I start with your definition, it sounds like an interesting mix of metabolism being the sum of all chemical reactions in the body, with adaptedness to a niche. And when I say a niche, as I've mentioned previously on the podcast, organisms are adapted to different types of niches. So you have both the spatial niche, but you also have the temporal niche. So spatial niche would be, is the organism aquatic or terrestrial? Temporal would be, is it diurnal or crepuscular or nocturnal or arrhythmic? But there is a lot within there that we'll return to later at some point too. And you also mentioned Brian Johnson. I can't help but comment in here because this makes me think of a post that I put up on Instagram, which happens very rarely, fortunately. But in that post, I put forward a term, orthogeria, in keeping with phenomena such as orthorexia and orthosomnia. And what I was getting at there is the ortho meaning the straightening of, and geria meaning age, is that some people are arguably unhealthily obsessed with defying aging, and it can be to the detriment of their life. And so while you could look at some people and think it is just a hobby, I think in many ways it is actually detracting from the richness of their experience. And I know people joke about how some things might not make you live longer, but you do them intending to live longer, and they actually just make it feel like you are living longer. And calorie restriction is the perfect case in point. But as you're saying, it is interesting to witness some of these trends. And one of the things that you and I have seen in recent times is lots of people, for example, boasting about their biological ages. I'm almost bored of posts that I see that are something along the lines of, I'm 56, but my biological age is 12. And I just
Yeah.
think, no, it's not. But we'll come back to biological age later. And instead, I actually just want to stay on the subject of health span specifically. So how then would you differentiate health span from health?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'd like to introduce just a couple of other ideas before we get there. And this is all about understanding health well so that we understand its elongation. And this will be for the conversation of health span. But there's a couple of key terms that are good to introduce now because we might revisit them in this discussion. So these are resilience and robustness. And a resilient system is, when I talked about it earlier, like the magnitude of health is reflected by the ability to handle a range of stressors. This is the term for that would be resilience. And so this is an ability of an organism to adapt to stress, to recover from damage or disruptions, and then to maintain a functional state. All right. So how do you maintain a functional state as a complete organism as you are experiencing different types of stresses as you traverse the world? So an analogy then is how much can a tree bend in the wind before it breaks? All right, that would be its ability to bounce back due to stressors. Robustness is similar, but it's a little bit of a different concept. And this is the ability to maintain relatively normal behavior despite changes in environmental conditions or even things that are part of your internal state, like, gene mutations, things like that. The best way, I was having a hard time really grappling between these two concepts. And so the analogy for me was actually quite useful in understanding them. Robustness is how much wind force a tree can handle before it bends, right? So resilience is how much can it bend before it breaks, and robustness is how much force can it handle before it even bends. That's speaking to this buffer. And both of those concepts are a reflection or a way to measure the amount of health that you have in a particular moment. And the other thing I'd like to mention about my definition is we talk about health almost like it is a binary concept. You either have it or you don't. In my definition, if you are alive, even the moment before you die, you have health. You have some form of health. It is low, but if you are alive, you have health. And when you are dead, you no longer have health. And so health is something that is always present, but the amount of it that you have is then determined by how old you are, how healthy you are, which is a lot of factors that kind of play in there. But anyway, those ideas to me are really important to grasp for a good understanding of what health is. Another thing that I like to mention is the nature of what humans are. And this goes into this idea of a complicated versus a complex system. So a complicated system, we often hear that humans are like machines, and that's wrong. So a complicated system is composed of many interconnected parts. And the more parts and the more relationships between those parts, the more complicated it is. But when you build a car, for instance, that car can undergo wear and tear, but it stays the same. It doesn't change, and the relationships between those parts don't change, even if you put it in different environments. A complex system is different. It has a whole different set of characteristics. So in my talk at IHMC, I talk about how humans grow into adults from babies, and that is considered the same person. You don't see a car grow from a Hot Wheels. I'm not sure if you have those in the UK, but they're little toy cars that kids play with, right? That's the adult car is built and stays the same and is weathered. Where humans have the ability to constantly change and adapt their biology. And so every 10 years, you're like an entirely different person with some degrees of overlap in terms of genes, whatnot. But even your genes, even though they're present, might not be active, or, they might be silenced. They might undergo mutations. So there is a constant evolution. And with things like complex systems, they undergo different types of forces, nonlinear dynamics, sensitivity to initial conditions. And I'll give you an example of that. So with embryo development, very sensitive to initial conditions. David Barker, for instance, at Oregon Health Science University, came up with FOAD, which is the fetal origins of disease. He did work looking at poor populations in the UK and in Norway, and he noticed that these poor populations had higher morbidity risk in midlife. And so this idea is that non-optimal fetal growth conditions led to fewer nephrons in the kidney, and as a result, this precipitated hypertension in midlife, right? So you can see how very early conditions led to downstream very different outcomes versus people that had earlier conditions that were different. So these are types of factors of a complex system that are really important to understand, and that also we undergo what is considered emergent phenomenon. So an idea here of how to understand that is flocking birds. So flocking birds maintain rules, like they understand these simple rules. A bird will maintain a certain distance to the bird that's left and right of it. But you cannot predict the behavior of the flock by just looking at the patterns of a single bird, right? That these complex patterns emerge. And if you've ever seen, let's say, starling murmurations, that is not a preconceived, pre-planned choreography. It is one that is constantly evolving in a very in a way that is emergent. Nobody knows what exactly is going to happen, and those are the types of forces also that are within us. That there also is a great deal of stochastic or randomness in our health. We don't have complete control over our outcomes, even if we were to attend to our health with avid fixation, doing everything right, always eating the best possible diet, even if we knew exactly what that was, maintaining all of the guidelines around exercise. There's an element of randomness that is unfair. And a really great quote that I said in the talk for IHMC is that the human genome undergoes 1 million molecular lesions per cell per day just due to normal metabolism and environmental stressors. So we need to repair all that damage. What if some of that damage is not perfectly repaired? That can then lead to randomness, like a very healthy person getting cancer. So those are other interesting properties that we should understand about health. And then, of course, there are different, characteristics of health that we can go into if you'd like. Key areas are basically maintaining spatial compartmentalization, being resilient to stress, which we've talked about, and then also processes that are promoting balance and homeostasis, which is such a rich concept. I've really dove into that and its history, and happy to discuss that if you want. But we can move on, either way, we can move on to healthspan too. But those are some things that I think about.
No, that's great. There's a lot to pick up on in there. I've got a feeling that that's going to be a theme of this conversation. And you mentioned spatial compartmentalization there. I'm guessing that you've read Guido Kromer and Carlos Lopez Otín's paper on the hallmarks of health.
Yeah.
So they came up with the hallmarks of aging alongside some other scientists, and then revised that recently. And then they wrote this paper 3 years ago or so on the hallmarks of health, which they've since added to. I think they've added something about psychology as a 9th dimension of their particular model. But it's a very interesting paper, and certainly one that's worth reading. It's quite physiology centric, understandably, given their backgrounds. But I think it's really important that you mentioned resilience there. And there was a paper that I read, and I wonder if you've read it too, Dan. It came out a couple of years ago in one of the Cell Press journals. And I think the lead author was Daniel Promislow, who's at Seattle. And it was about resilience as a unifying theme in geroscience. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they speak about in that paper is the concept of tipping points. So going back to what you were saying about resilience and your tree analogy, another analogy, which is really the same thing, is that you can think of this as being a bit like an elastic band, where when somebody is young and resilient, you can pull on the elastic band and it will bounce back. So if you looked at somebody's heart rate response to exercise, then it might increase dramatically during the exercise, but quite quickly after, when they were resting, their heart rate would recover to its baseline level. or
Yep.
close to its baseline level. And what happens over time is that if the stressor is too large or it lasts for too long, then you can surpass a tipping point. And beyond that, the system no longer behaves the same way. And then for
Yep.
various reasons, that can spill over into other bodily systems. And this loss of resilience ultimately gives rise to various different types of pathology. But
Yep.
definitely in keeping with what you were saying, and there's another related concept that is interesting and actually ties into what you were saying about human development, and that is that of canalization. And this is something that I first came across during my undergrad. I did a module on human growth and development with Barry Bogan and Noel
Okay.
Cameron. And the concept of canalization, I think, was first put forward by Conrad Waddington in the mid 20th century. And he used it to describe the fate of different cells in response to changes in their epigenetics. But the developmental biologists then took the same idea of canalization and applied it in a different way, specifically with respect to human growth. So if you look at kids who are growing, who are temporarily deprived of adequate nutrition, so going back to what you're saying about the fetal origins of disease and Barker's developmental hypothesis, then when they are refed, they will experience what's called catch-up growth, where they were originally in a canal and they were moved out of the canal by the nutritional stress, but there's something about their program that pushes them back in towards that canal. And some scientists have recently taken the
Mm.
same idea and applied it in yet another way, which is psychopathology. And there was a review article that came out not long ago by Carl Friston, Robin Carhart Harris, and others that spoke about canalization in the context of mental health. What they were suggesting is that what can happen over time is that as people age, they tend to get stuck in their ways. They get stuck in certain patterns of behaving and thinking. And it's like the grooves in the landscape get deeper and deeper. And it's harder to get out of those. And you see this in the case of depression. And
Yeah.
various different interventions might be able to shake up the landscape. And after that, people might be able to choose a different path. And
Yeah.
they were writing this in the context of use of psychedelics, but thinking about psychological health. Healthy psychology is characterized by that type of psychological flexibility that often falls by the wayside as people get older. I just want to return to the concept of health span too before we move on. There are different ways of defining health span, and there are negative definitions such as how long you live before the period of your life that's characterized by chronic disease. But I wonder if you might think about that a different way.
Yeah. By the way, just thank you for that comment on canalization. I'll add a few more things there, and then I'll talk about healthspan here. But just to go into this idea of balance and homeostasis, and then deviating outside of these ranges, and the body's ability to get back into that state of stability. And it probably would make sense to use a Daniel Schmachtenberger term to double click on that. But I'll start talking about homeostasis, and then we can move into allostasis, which is relevance here. But so this idea of homeostasis is this self-stabilizing system. That's what humans are. It's self-stabilizing. It is definitely a central pillar of modern physiology. It is one of the hallmarks of health described by, or it's a part of many of them, in fact. There seems to be redundancy there. They are supporting this ability to maintain balance. And the idea was identified in 1865 by Claude Bernard, who's a famous French physiologist, considered the father of experimental physiology. And he described this idea of the internal milieu. And this referred to a constancy of the internal environment. So it's the homeostatic principle. Well, then in 1926, Walter Bradford Cannon, who's an American physiologist, he is in the direct research lineage of Claude Bernard. So he did his work via Bernard's student, Nathaniel Bowditch. And it was Cannon that actually coined the term homeostasis. He also coined the term fight or flight, by the way. And there are some who have speculated that his identification of fight or flight and homeostasis has led to an unholy connection between those two, meaning that they're maybe more assimilated because of what he was focusing on at that time. But that's sort of a separate concept. But anyway, this idea of homeostasis, homeo in Greek means similar or alike, and stasis means standing or stability. So it literally translates to staying the same. And he had these four concepts that were important for homeostasis, that constancy in our body requires mechanisms that act to maintain that constancy. That homeostasis results from organized self-government, that this is not by chance. Stable conditions automatically react to changes with factors that resist that change. So in a stable system, when there is change, it automatically kicks in factors that are resisting that change. And that these stability systems have multiple competing or cooperating, sometimes competing mechanisms that act either simultaneously or successively. So that was this idea of how do we maintain this internal balance across the myriad systems in our body that are supporting health and life. This idea of allostasis is something that is anticipating needs that deviate outside those common experiences that the body is calibrated to, but also has the ability to then restore homeostasis. So this sounds actually similar to this canalization that you were talking about. This idea of allostatic load, this is now another concept based on top of this. This was coined by Bruce McEwen in 1993. He's a professor at Rockefeller University in New York City. He studied neuroscience and stress biology. And basically this idea is the general wear and tear in the body. So this idea of load comes from overactivation of the neuroendocrine system to stress over time, from things like psychological stress, physiological stressors like starvation. And at some point, these compensatory mechanisms, they basically overwhelm the system and they lead to damage themselves. So there's only so many times that we can deviate outside of that range before it eventually leads to like a physiological scar, if you will, as an analogy, that would then impair function later in life. So yeah, the problem though with this is that you'd expect to see this idea correlate well with aging, mortality, morbidity risk, but there's not great agreement on how to measure it, allostatic load. And so it makes it a little hard to study and compare results. Similar ideas to healthspan, in fact. And so it's a little bit more theoretical than it is physiological. But the concept is probably true to some extent. And then that begets this idea that is very popular now over the last couple of years, hormesis, which is actually putting the body under forms of stressors. This is an idea coined by Gerald Southam in 1941. And these ideas are that if you have these subtoxic stimuli that can come from temperature, oxidative stress, emotional stress even, that these drive adaptations and plasticity and gene expression. And some people have said that the better term for all of this is actually adaptive homeostasis. And so the definition here is that this is transient shifts due to these subtoxic signals. So think of the NRF2 pathway that gained popularity from people like Rhonda Patrick talking about it with various compounds that can stimulate it. And this then, by seeking out these types of stressors, you actually boost your protective capacity. They make you healthier, not less healthy. So right now we seem to there's a balance here between allostatic load and willfully putting ourselves under these various forms of stressors that expand our homeodynamic space or our stress buffer. So those are it might just be the degree to which the stress occurs. And a way to think about this is exercise is good, right? We know exercise is good and healthy for us. It serves as a hormetic stress. If you look at the physiology of somebody immediately post-exercise, it looks like we've made ourselves less healthy. You see increases in inflammation and oxidative stress, DNA damage, but the body reacts to that by increasing our stress tolerance, and we know long-term that does make us healthy. If you were, however, to exercise in a manner where you were always exceeding what your body could handle, you could imagine exercise being a form of an age acceleration. It would be an allostatic load that would not serve to your health, but actually would detract from it. That's a way to understand the differences between allostatic load and adaptive homeostasis. But that is all additional comments that kind of lead into health span. So we understand health now better, and health span is the proportion of life that is. And there's definitions that are different, and the problem with that leads to issues with how to study this. But the percentage of life with optimal health, so significantly free from disease. That's an okay definition. Although I think you can have health span with carrying several diseases with you. And we can dive into this now because this is a sort of a squishy, loose concept too. And I mean, I like to see it as the ability to adapt, to recover and adapt from health challenges, right? Minimizing the impact on age-related physiological changes. So as you're getting older, you do have that rubber band ability to snap back. And can you facilitate and maintain that in the way that you live, and also with a little bit of good luck from, the other factors that shape your health.
One important point to emphasize is that avoiding stress is not a good thing. Some people nowadays seem to put all stress in the category of unhelpful.
Yeah.
And actually, it seems to be the case that when people do actively avoid stress, things that didn't used to be stressful become stressful. And so now there's this interesting rise, the use of certain types of mindset interventions, focusing on stress-related mindsets. And this work's been done by people like David Yeager. He and his colleagues published some work in a very high-profile journal not long ago, showing that combining a growth mindset with a stress can be enhancing mindset improved the responses of young people to different types of psychological stress. They, for example, had lower stress responses following different things that would previously have been more distressing. So what we should be aiming for is to periodically push ourselves near the limit of our current capacities, but not past that tipping point. And that way we're trying to maintain the range of conditions that we can successfully adapt to the largest extent for as long as possible throughout our lives.
Yeah. The body will seek economy. It will shrink if it's not facing stressors. The stress buffer will shrink, which means that you are more likely then to deal with types of stressors that will actually stress you out in the more common parlance of how people understand stress. It's one of the reasons that I have my boys, which are 10 and 5, do jujitsu. A couple weekends ago, last weekend in fact, my boy Desmond was in a jujitsu competition, his third, and it's a very stressful thing for a young person to go through. Unlike other sports, this is direct combat that has controls on it. You are facing off in a way to try to submit another person. And after almost every match, there are tears. Not because somebody is, hurt in a significant way, but because there's so much emotion that goes into that direct confrontation with another person. One of the things that you and I know is in doing this, having these formative years where you do engage with significant stressors will make you more resistant to types of stresses that you will undoubtedly face in life. Financial stress, relationship stress, work stress. And so cultivating this idea is really important for a better life, a better quality of life. So to your point, avoiding those types of stressors is not the optimal path to having a life that you can navigate through easily.
Doing jiu-jitsu or something similar is a nice example of something that somebody could do in their activities of daily living that would confer various health benefits through several mechanisms. So just on that subject, I was just thinking about how to conceptualize the different modifiable determinants of health. So physical activity, nutrition, biological rhythms, sleep, and so on. Given you've been writing your book, Dan, I imagine that you've thought quite a lot about this. And I also know that you previously used the stool analogy, which is one that I think is helpful.
Yeah, I forgot about that. um, the stool analogy was in response to a question that people who work in health often get, which is more, diet or exercise, sleep or exercise, sleep or diet. The stool analogy is, if you want a functioning chair that has, let's say, 3 legs, to keep this idea simple. It should be 4 legs, because a 3-legged chair is just not going to be very stable. But which leg's most important? The one in the front and the left, the one on the right and the left. They all are. All of those are important. The one that becomes most important might be the one that's broken. And when I mean important, I mean requires your focus and attention in that moment. But it doesn't make the other legs less important to a functioning chair. Keep that in mind. That's a very helpful concept. And the way that I like to break down a model that I created for these determinants of health is to think about exposures, behaviors, and what I call pressures. So exposures are things in your environment that are having an influence on you. Our health, we should not be internalists, meaning that we think all health derives from what's happening inside the body, but rather it is a relationship with what is happening outside of the body and in our environment. Humans' physiology is calibrated to specific environmental conditions. So biology, for instance, can thrive in the water. You have a Greenland shark that can live almost 300 years in water, but it can't live for 30 minutes outside of water because its biology is not suited for that. Similarly, humans have a unique set of conditions that our biology requires in order for us to thrive. So this is going to be things like temperature, air quality, even things like radiation. So from radiation from the sun. In my TED Talk, I even talked about gravity. Like, there are things that we don't even consider because they are unfluctuating parts of our existence. But if they were to change, we would then appreciate their impact on health. They are determinants of health. We just don't think about them because we don't really need to at this time. But you put a human into space as an astronaut, and they're going to suffer the consequences of a microgravity environment. That's going to lead to really poor health outcomes and quick. So those are the environmental conditions in which we live. Behaviors are the ways in which we interact with our environment, including social. So this is diet, exercise, sleep, things like that. And those matter as well. And then what I call pressures, which is forces of modern life that don't give you much option on how your exposures into your behaviors. So for instance, your diet, you might tear to have an ideal diet, but if you have young children, you might have to be making food that is acceptable for them, so you don't have to make 3 different dinners. You have work in an office, and so you're spending all of your time indoors in a seated position, working at a computer with artificial forms of blue light entering into the eye that might damage your mitochondria, that are unique from a natural environment. These types of pressures shape where we're spending our time and how we live, and can be very difficult to change. So those are the things we talk about. Readily modifiable, that these are still things that we can change, but it might take more effort, and some of them might not be as modifiable as we think. If you, for example, don't have a lot of financial resources, what you eat might be entirely dependent on what you can afford in that week. But things like don't smoke, right? Don't abuse substances. These are things that you can have more agency over to not do. Although not doing so, if you've developed an addiction with them, can be very challenging. Diet, nutrition, it has its own challenges. Lots of philosophies about what is and what isn't good for you that are completely polar to orthogonal philosophies, vegan versus carnivore. By the way, and I'll mention that one of the reasons why I mentioned a complex adaptive system is because it is a fool's errand to try to identify a single best diet, because human physiology can adapt to environmental conditions that it is placed under. Therefore, yes, let's say one type of diet, carnivore or vegan, they're polar opposites in their philosophy of what drives health. But the body, the point that I'm making is that the body, it's not like you're putting diesel gas into an unleaded engine. It would never work if you try to put the wrong fuel type into a complicated system. But the human body is going to start to make instantaneous and evolved changes that is going to try to do its best under the conditions in which it is exposed to. So that is something that we need to consider. And it's why there isn't a singular best diet that we've been easily able to identify. Physical activity. How can you move during the day? What is your sleep like? Can you manage your stress? So yes, there are psychological elements to stress as well. And stress management should include willfully seeking out various forms of stressors like exercise, and also having cognitive tools that enable you to process psychological stress in a way that makes it less harmful, to disarm it in a way. Are you somebody who catastrophizes little stressors in your life, making a large deal out of them, thereby making them more stressful? Or are you somebody that can filter various forms of stressors in your life in a way that is proactive and is looking to sort of see the positive in all of those? So those are things that are more modifiable as determinants of health. And the less modifiable ones are going to be things like, genetics, age, gender, sex, even some of those early life conditions like we talked about earlier. Those things are characteristic to who you are and cannot change, but we do understand that they do have an impact on your health and longevity. Or there are things that happen to you at an earlier age when you were not in control of how you spent your time. And there's even things that even happened before you were born, like the environment that your parents were in and their parents were in, and the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance that occurs from that. So think of epigenetics as an environmental memory, and these changes that occur to this epigenetic layer that sits above our genome is controlling gene transcription. And the purpose of that is to then try to, again, prepare the organism so that it is well acclimated to the conditions it's facing. But some of those changes can actually be inherited by subsequent generations, and that can lead to poor health outcomes. So, my father was raised, the business for the family was dry cleaning. From 10 years old to 20, he spent 10 years in a highly toxic environment. And sadly, he passed away at age 59 from cancer. I would say sadly, but perhaps not unexpectedly. And I would not be surprised if my sister and myself have some epigenetic consequence from the exposures that he faced. And there's some work by Adam Closen, who was done in C. elegans roundworms, but he showed that at least in that population, epigenetic inheritance can last 15 or 14 generations. So we don't know how long that lasts in humans, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is some epigenetic memory that goes back along.
I forget where I came across that, but I came across that research recently. It was looking at thermal stress, wasn't it? So clearly we're talking about several generations here potentially. And it sounds like within your model, the pressures are kinds of constraints on the other two categories, the behaviors and the exposures. And the pressures are probably the thing that determine just how modifiable those different categories are. And I'm glad that you mentioned nutrition there, because I've always been concerned about people consuming increasingly restrictive diets and the downstream consequences of that in later life. And there's been some intriguing research in recent years looking at things like mothers who consume peanuts around pregnancy versus those who don't, and then the subsequent risk of their offspring having peanut allergies.
Yeah.
And it seems that having some exposure to those types of allergens at that stage tunes the immune system in ways that reduce the risk of developing subsequent allergies. And there are all sorts of nutrition examples that we could give here, but if you've been on a carnivore diet for years and you start reintroducing plants, you are, of course, going to have a really hard time. So,
Yeah.
in that context, diversity is really important. But in other contexts, it is too. This is also the case for exercise. It goes back to the use it or lose it principle. This is why, for you and I, Dan, if we went back and started trying to play five-a-side football tomorrow and we're not used to it, we might well tear a muscle because we just haven't been using our bodies in those ways in recent years. So we've got to keep pushing those boundaries as we get older.